This project started with a simple question. Where, in what kind of spaces do youth in China produce, consume and share culture?
Our focus was on millennials born in People's Republic of China after the 1980s. Of course, youth in China is far from homogeneous. There is not one youth, but many, and we tried as much as possible to include different youths from rural areas, urban elites, ethnic or sexual minorities, marginalized as well as mainstream groups. Similarly, we looked at all types of cultural productions, from cosplay to cyber literature, homemade web series or popular cinema, hip-hop or rap music, barrage subtitling, calligraphy, festivals and museums, opera and drinking games, etc.
We wanted to take a special approach. We wanted to understand how spaces shape everyday cultural practices among young people in China, and conversely, how these practices were shaping and influencing on spaces in China.
To answer these questions, we invited China scholars from the fields of art, literature, film, anthropology, sociology, media, and cultural studies, and from 3 continents, namely Asia, North America, and Europe. We looked at a range of spaces, public squares, parks, performance and recreational spaces, pedestrian streets, formal urban public spaces, and commercial retail spaces, but also digital spaces, such as online social networks and communities, blogging, digital sharing venues, websites, and online diaries that are largely employed by Chinese youth.
All these new physical and virtual spaces that emerged for most of them in the 90s are incredible platform for culture, consumption and creation within the Chinese youth. Rather than public spaces, we opted for the term collective spaces because throughout the chapters we realized that sociality is at least as important as the content of culture that is produced in these spaces. Temple festivals, cosplay conventions, barrage subtitling, all these forms of cultures are spaces to create forms of association and to bridge between the individual and the collective.
We found that these collective spaces in which youth evolve and socialize are not fixed or definitive, but rather engage in a process of permanent change. They can even be mobile spaces, sometimes like cars or vans or a motorcycle. Youth often create and consume culture navigating between the official and the non-official, the formal and the informal, the local and the global.
In that sense, not all youth cultures are countercultures or subcultures. It's not all black and white. In fact, nomadic youth culture constantly navigates between wild, non-organized spaces and spaces imprinted by regulations and laws by the state or other authorities. But in any case, Chinese youth culture are an incredible window on Chinese contemporary society.
The first part of the book focuses on the production and consumption of mass culture in collective spaces such as shopping malls, leisure parks, squares, bars, entertaining districts, and other cool places. In the first chapter, Huabin shows how commercial spaces have reshaped and nomadized cosplay practices in China, and how youth still manage in this context to negotiate their own third space. Then Honglei looks at Chinese rock music, which shifted from a rebellious and protest-oriented movement in the 80s to an object of consumption in both underground and more mainstream spaces. In chapter 3, Christina Wu looks at online discussions on a popular online talent show of hip-hop and shows how rapping in China navigates between acceptance in mainstream culture and subversion.
The second part of the book looks at sociability within the consumption and the production of culture among young Chinese. Adam Zhou, for instance, look at the rural area of Shanpei in north-central China and the ways young people are unable to produce culture through institutions like temples or schools, through media like the internet or VCD, for instance. He also looks at places where young people consume culture. It could be on motorcycle, on the roads, or it could be in internet cafe, for instance, or in karaoke. And he also looks at different practices like drinking games, like roaming around in the countryside, and so on. Seiyo Nakajima, in the next chapter, analyzes barrage subtitling in China. Barrage subtitling is a system in which viewers' comments appear directly on screen while the video is being played. And Nakajima shows that, in order to capture the nature of this youth culture in cyberspace, how millennials communicate is just as important, if not more important, than what they communicate. Finally, my own chapter shows how a popular online Uyghur series called Anarpishti used collective laughter to face highly competitive interactions in collective outdoor areas such as parking lots, residential compounds and streets in a critical time in the Uyghur region.
Moving away from perceptions of youth as solely materialist and individualist, the third part of the book highlights that youth in China also place a high value on civic engagement and engage in political. Elizabeth Brunner's chapter emphasizes youth creative tactics in using a hypermediated environment to engage in political conversations, taking the 2016 air pollution protests in Chengdu as a case study. Sten de Klerk, in this chapter, discusses efforts of LGBT+ activists to claim physical and symbolic spaces through film festivals and other artistic performances. Eric Florence documents how collectives of young migrant workers engage in giving more visibility to their community through poetry, literature, and museums.
The last part of the book takes us to unique travel through time and space. Looking at time travel and alternative history fiction online, Gwennaël Gaffric observes the collective and interactive dimension of the creation of this new type of cyber literature. In the following chapter, Corrado Neri looks at a film by Han Han, a young blogger and icon in China. The film Duckweed is to Corrado Neri an unofficial adaptation of Back to the Future and questions the very foundation of Chinese contemporary society. In that chapter, Laura Vermeuren and Jeroen de Cloot looks at the resurgence of calligraphy practices among young people as a symbol of Chinese traditional culture.
Last but not least, in her concluding chapter, Lisa Richaud offers vivid reflections on the positive affectivity, fun, playfulness, positive energy described in several chapters to ask whether these dominant tonalities of China's youth cultures might constitute an impassable, undisrupted threshold toward more overt demands for change and alternative imaginations of the future.
In his review for the China Quarterly, John Sullivan praised our book for making him rethink and reconsider things that he had taken for granted. We hope you can enjoy the book too, whether in a physical public space like a library or a virtual space at home on your tablet. And we really hope you can share with us your feelings and your comments about the book. Thank you.